I love my country just like most Americans do. But love alone is not enough for our country to continue its brilliant path. We need the right foreign policy. Love of our country is why I'm making this presentation. Love of our country is what I hope will motivate you to consider it. Does it make any difference to you whether we invade other countries? Can you continue to live just as well regardless of how many countries we invade and regardless of why we invade them? What was the reasoning that supported the war in Iraq? What will be the consequences of the war? And finally, the most important question, what principle should we use to decide whether or not to invade countries in the future? These are just some of the questions that we're going to answer. We interviewed U.S. congressmen and a U.S. congresswoman in our quest to answer these questions, as well as former administration officials, analysts, and a member of the press. You will see some intense reactions to my questions like,
it was very nice to be with you.
You can't answer the other questions we have? Excuse me, sir. You're taking the microphone with you. You will also get some insights into our leaders' mental processes. It's important to consider our decision to invade Iraq because we're going to have to make the same kind of decision again and again. Analyzing the reasons why we went to war with Iraq will permit us to glean some principles that we can use the next time we are confronted with the choice to invade or not invade. Essentially, there were two basic rationales for invading Iraq. The first was that the Iraqi regime was a threat to the United States because they had weapons of mass destruction that they were going to either use directly or indirectly through terrorist proxies. The second rationale was that we should invade Iraq to liberate the Iraqi people from Saddam's evil dictatorship and then create a democracy. We were going to examine each rationale independently, starting with the second. Let's see how President Bush expressed the second rationale in his State of the Union address.
I have a message for the brave and oppressed people of Iraq. Your enemy is not surrounding your country. Your enemy is ruling your country. And the day he and his regime are removed from power will be the day of your liberation. We exercise power without conquest, and we sacrifice for the liberty of strangers.
How and when was President Bush persuaded that the federal government should force American citizens to sacrifice for the liberty of strangers? When did liberating other nations and creating democracies become the responsibility of the federal government? He certainly did not think so when he was campaigning as governor for president. Let's see what he had to say on this subject during the debates.
So I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation building. I think what we need to do is convince people who live in the lands they live in to build the nations. Maybe I'm missing something here. I mean, we're going to have kind of a nation-building corps from America? Absolutely not.
The United States is presently nation-building in Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, among others. Arnaud de Borgrave is a veteran anti-communist conservative, by no means a peacenik. Who do you think he agrees with, Bush the candidate or Bush the president?
You know, there's no ideal model of democracy. Everybody finds his own way of governing. Some are terrible, some are mediocre, some are good. The United States cannot expect that everybody is going to emulate our own model of democracy. And to think that you can impose democracy in the Middle East is a pipe dream. Again, education, prosperous middle class, all these things take time.
People have to adhere to certain values that are the basis for democracy and for a constitutional republic before they can actually change their system. It cannot be imposed from outside, because if the people don't adhere to those values, they won't hold. Is that your view?
Absolutely, and especially if it's perceived to be an American system being imposed from the outside.
Because each country has a certain amount of nationalism, including our own country. And they don't like other people to come in and tell them how to run their country.
That is correct.
Former CIA defense contractor and consulting firm Booz, Allen, and Hamilton expressed the president's second rationale for going to war as follows.
The principle is that over the last 80-some years, I think really beginning with the Wilson administration, the United States has successfully moved a large number of countries, only a handful by force of arms, toward democracy.
Apparently, the former CIA director does not distinguish between moving a country to democracy through persuasion and moving them through force of arms. For him, both are equally good. Furthermore, he thinks that jamming democracy down other countries' throat will work. Compare that view with Arnold de Borgrave's. Do you think that it's sufficient reason to invade another country that they have an evil dictator who has weapons of mass destruction, has violated his people's rights, and has attacked a neighbor?
Well, that's certainly the underpinnings of the Bush doctrine of preemption.
As you were saying before, if we apply that doctrine, as each country comes close to having nuclear weapons or has them, we would then have to have the burden of going in there and preempting and doing regime change country after country. Isn't that a scenario that makes absolutely no sense?
Well, it doesn't make much sense to me. It worked with Iraq, and I can see them trying it again with one other country. Eventually, it'll reach the point of diminishing returns, and I think you will have a backlash on the home front. People will say, enough is enough. We're not here to police the whole world.
I asked the former CIA director whether there was any constitutional authority to promote freedom by invading other countries. Is promoting freedom a proper function of our government? And if so,
yes.
In what part of the Constitution does it say so?
The whole Constitution is about freedom.
But promoting freedom in the rest of the world is a responsibility of the federal government in the Constitution?
Protecting the United States over the long run has been vastly enhanced by the fact that administrations going back to the World War I era have used force abroad and formed alliances and persuaded people to move toward democracy.
Excuse me, my question was that what part of the Constitution does it say that we are supposed to promote freedom in the rest of the world?
The Constitution starts out by talking about promoting the common defense.
In the United States. The Constitution only authorizes the use of force in the common defense of the states. For force to be considered defensive, someone has to be attacking us or there has to be an imminent threat of attack. The generalization that dictatorships are generally more aggressive than democracies cannot be used to justify an attack on any dictatorship we feel like. The reason why he cannot find a rational justification for nation building is because there is none. Bush the candidate was right. Back to the White House. Let's consider the other rationale for going to war, which was that the Iraqi regime was a threat to the United States because they had weapons of mass destruction that they were going to use either directly or indirectly through terrorist proxies. Let's see how President Bush put it in his State of the Union address.
Today, the gravest danger in the war on terror, the gravest danger facing America and the world, is outlaw regimes that seek and possess nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. These regimes could use such weapons for blackmail, terror, and mass murder. They could also give or sell those weapons to terrorist allies who would use them without the least hesitation.
Obviously, if the Iraqi regime does not have significant amounts of weapons of mass destruction, the president's argument collapses. The war was sold to the American people on the basis that the Iraqi regime had enormous amounts of weapons of mass destruction that they intended to use against us. Listen.
U.S. intelligence indicates that Saddam Hussein had upwards of 30,000 munitions capable of delivering chemical agents, 500 tons of sarin, mustard, and VX nerve agent, over 25,000 liters of anthrax, 38,000 liters of botulinum toxin. He hadn't accounted for that material. He's given no evidence that he has destroyed it. Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The president has already had to retract his claim that Saddam purchased uranium from Africa. Several months have gone by since we took over Baghdad and no weapons of mass destruction have been found. If it turns out that Saddam did not have significant amounts of weapons of mass destruction, then Saddam was not a threat to us and our consent for the war was obtained under false pretenses. Let's see if Arnaud de Borgrav thinks that Saddam was a threat.
Well, there's a whole new dimension now to geopolitics, is that we can attack a country, preempt and attack a country that has not even threatened us. Iraq had not threatened us prior to this war. I've interviewed Saddam 3 times in my life. He's a horrible man, and we all know that. He's done some terrible things to his own people.
He was in power for 24 years and he never used weapons of mass destruction against a superpower like us, right?
No, he did not, and he never threatened the United States.
Right, because he knew that he would be obliterated if he did that.
Correct.
Everybody agrees that if there is an imminent threat of attack by another country, it is proper for us to use military force against them. The issue is whether it is proper to use military force if there is no imminent threat as a preemptive measure. The president offered several arguments for his change in policy from deterrence to preemption. Let's hear from the president and analyze them one at a time. The first argument was that there is a new and dangerous situation because
Take one vial, one canister, one crate, slipped into this country to bring a day of horror like none we have ever known.
there's nothing new about this situation. For 50 years we've been exposed to an attack by the Soviet Union that would make 9/11 or a vial slipped into this country look like child's play. The Soviet Union was an evil dictatorship that hated us and had all kinds of weapons of mass destruction in enormous quantities. However, they and other tyrants were deterred from attacking us by our threat of retaliation. The president's second argument for preemption was,
Some have said we must not act until the threat is imminent. Since when have terrorists and tyrants announced their intentions, politely putting us on notice before they strike? Trusting in the sanity and restraint of Saddam Hussein is not a strategy, and it is not an option.
why does the president now think that it's okay to invade another country, even though there is no imminent threat of attack? It seems that the president cannot distinguish between a terrorist and a dictator. Apparently, the president thinks that 9/11 proves that deterrence doesn't work. However, just because a terrorist organization that has no specific address is undeterred does not mean that a dictator with an address would also be undeterred. Deterrence works with a dictator because he knows that we know where to find him. Thus, to strike Saddam because bin Laden was undeterred makes no sense, and I might add, is patently unfair. That is why when I discuss the issue with Congressman Hayworth, he ends up arguing that fairness doesn't matter. Has Saddam Hussein participated in the planning or execution of 9/11?
I believe we are not in an American courtroom, that in conduct of nations and nation states, and ultimately in the defense of this country, we move now, I believe, preemptively to remove threats. And I believe Saddam Hussein represents a clear and present danger to the United States.
Can I interpret that answer as that you believe that he did participate in the planning or execution of 9/11?
Certainly there was a blessing. Now, did Saddam Hussein sit down with Osama bin Laden and plot these attacks? Probably not.
Is it fair to hold Saddam Hussein responsible for something that Al-Qaeda did and he didn't participate in?
Let me reject a notion that may come to you as a bit of innovative thinking. This is not about fairness.
Watch Congresswoman Wilson interrogate me on whether deterrence is a better strategy than preemption.
So you're suggesting that what we should do is just let him have weapons of mass destruction,
That's what we
and
did
the problem grows over time?
Yeah, that's what we did
And
with the other dictators, and it worked fine
Do you think
for
we
50 years.
should we wait to be attacked by a biological weapon?
That's what we did with the other dictators. All the dictators were kept in check in the world. They knew they had weapons of mass destruction. If they attacked us, what would happen? We would obliterate them.
So,
Saddam Hussein knows the same thing. Why won't it work with him as well?
so should we just trust him?
In the sense that we trusted the other guys, all we did was make clear, look, if you attack us, we're going to obliterate you. That worked perfectly. Why not use that strategy again with him? Let's see if Congresswoman Wilson agrees with the president that Saddam is either insane or suicidal, and therefore deterrence won't work. You think he's suicidal?
No.
He's not suicidal, right? Right.
I think there's certainly an element of self-preservation there.
Right, because he's been in power for 23 years. You don't stay in power that long without wanting to live and stay in power. It was very unlikely that Saddam would give or sell weapons of mass destruction to Al-Qaeda to use against us because they were adversaries. They were in a power struggle. Let's see if I can get Congressman Hayworth to accept this fact.
I understand that there are distinctions of theology, and he refers to Saddam as an infidel.
They don't like each other.
Well, I don't know. Saddam
Is there a
has
power,
comments.
well, let me ask you your view on the facts. Is there a power struggle between the Muslim fundamentalists and the secular Arab governments today?
Oh, yes.
Right, so the Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, they're Muslim fundamentalists. They want to get rid of Saddam. They're adversaries, are they not?
They are adversaries to a certain degree.
The third argument for preemption was that because a dictator has abused his own people, we can expect him to attack a superpower. This argument was implied when the president said,
The dictator who is assembling the world's most dangerous weapons has already used them on whole villages, leaving thousands of his own citizens dead, blind, or disfigured.
the fact that Saddam Hussein used weapons of mass destruction against his own people is irrelevant to the question of whether he would use them against a superpower like us. The relevant fact is that Saddam Hussein never used weapons of mass destruction against any superpower for the 24 years of his regime. Let's see if Congresswoman Wilson agrees with this fact. We're agreed that he's willing to use them against a small nation or weak people, his own people, but he's never attacked a superpower, has he?
There's not one in his neighborhood.
Yeah, well, there's the Soviet Union. They're pretty close. He hasn't even attacked middle-range nations like Turkey.
He's certainly an aspiring regional power. That's true.
Right.
He would like to dominate
So
that
he's
region.
he's your classical dictator bully who bullies people that are weaker, but cows to people that are stronger. Who does Congressman Meeks think is the real threat to America?
America's number one enemy and whom we need to go after and get is Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And I think he's not only a danger to America, he's a danger to the international community, because that is the one that has had the terrorists and terrorist bombings in various other countries across the globe. Not Saddam Hussein, not Iraq. There's not one terrorist attack that's been accredited or even connected to Saddam Hussein and Iraq.
As far as I can tell, no evidence or reasoning was ever offered to rationally conclude that we should go to war with Iraq. The president failed to prove that Saddam planned to use weapons of mass destruction against us. We haven't even found weapons of mass destruction, much less proof that Saddam intended to use them against us. The president and the other proponents of the war also failed to explain why nation building should be considered a responsibility of the federal government. The president never explained why he had been mistaken when, as a presidential candidate, he had argued against nation building and had mocked the idea of a nation-building core of America, something he is now presiding over. Furthermore, the President did not foresee that Iraq would be like a tar baby. The more we deal with it, the more mucked up and bogged down we get. The President did not foresee the consequences of the war. Before you make up your mind on whether we should have invaded Iraq, you should give yourself the opportunity to consider all the negative consequences resulting from the war and the change in policy. Here are some of the answers offered by our guests. What negative consequences do you think there will be?
I think that American forces who are there, young men and women, may die.
I have never seen such hatred of the United States. The intensity of the hatred right now among moderate Arabs is quite extraordinary. So I see a prolonged period of hit-and-run guerrilla warfare.
Is the war on Iraq detracting from the war on terrorism?
Well, I never quite understood how we switched from the war on terror to the war on Iraq without missing a beat. But what's just happened is bound to drive Iraqi extremists or the remnants of the Saddam regime into the arms of Al-Qaeda.
The American people would be safer without invading Iraq, because the wrong message goes if we invade Iraq. Because the message then is, and this is what Osama bin Laden is trying to play on, and he clearly indicated in the last statement that I heard him say that he has nothing to do. He called Saddam Hussein an infidel. But what it will do is he then will try to make this to be a war against Muslims and Islam.
Do you think that we'll have to pay more taxes as a result of this war?
Without any question. The tax cuts have already been severely reduced. Eventually, I think will have to be eliminated. The deficit is growing by leaps and bounds. The advance payment on the war is $75 billion. Congress added another $5 billion. That's only for 6 months. By the time we're through with all of this, it will be well over $200 billion in my judgment.
Each time we intervene militarily in other countries preemptively, we create enemies in that country. Is that not so?
Well, not only enemies, but look at the wreckage that has already been caused. If you look at the geopolitical landscape, you will see nothing but wreckage of institutions that have been taken decades to build. Look at NATO, torn asunder, the European Union, torn asunder, the cornerstone of the transatlantic partnership is the German-American alliance, torn asunder.
Is the cornerstone of international law respecting other countries' national sovereignty, and when we do preventive or preemptive attacks, military attacks, are we not undermining that fundamental principle that has helped world peace?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you think that one of the negative consequences is that more countries will follow our example and do preemptive strikes on their enemies?
It is a danger, a distinct danger. If you look at the situation between Pakistan and India, I've been arguing for a long time that that was far more serious, is far more serious than anything Saddam was threatening the world with.
You recall when India massed its troops on the border with Pakistan, our position was that they should show restraint and not do any attacking. Now we are, in effect, reversing that policy and doing exactly what we requested them not to do. Isn't that a double standard that's not going to hold?
Of course it's a double standard, and incidentally the people who were most active in promoting a war on Iraq now wish to go on and do something about Iran.
Will more nations go nuclear to prevent future U.S. interventions?
I think it's inevitable. The ultimate badge of power is the nuclear badge.
So our interventionist policy is actually stimulating nuclear proliferation and therefore making the world less safe.
You could draw that conclusion.
And that could be really dangerous for all Americans if there was a nuclear holocaust.
Yes.
If, for example, we did the contrary, if we had a non-interventionist policy, countries could be assured that we were going to respect their national sovereignty even if we disagreed with their regimes, then they would not see a need to obtain nuclear weapons.
That could also be a conclusion drawn from the arguments that you make.
Sometimes a good way to understand how other people feel is to put the shoe on your own foot and see how it feels. How do the Americans, or how would the Americans feel if other countries intervene in our internal politics? For example, how did they feel when China was alleged to have made some campaign contributions? What was the reaction of the American public?
Well, as you know, it was very negative.
And
we don't like it when people interfere here.
we can't get away with these double standards forever, because double standards always catch up to you. Is that not right?
You're correct.
Just for the record, here's a short list of the double standards we're trying to get away with. It's okay for us to attack preemptively, but other countries like Israel or India shouldn't. It's okay for us to have troops and bases all around the world, but other countries shouldn't have any here. It's okay for us to have nuclear weapons, but other countries shouldn't. It's okay for us to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries, but other countries shouldn't intervene in ours. Why do you think we have so many double standards in our foreign policy? How and why did we arrive at a contradictory foreign policy that led us to invade Iraq in spite of all the negative consequences? The reason is simple. Our leaders are not reasoning properly on the subject. We should take a moment to examine the cause of the flaws in the reasoning so we don't make the same mistake again and again on this subject, or for that matter, on any other. If a person really does not want to know the truth and is therefore unwilling to answer questions responsively because they're trying to evade facts, they will come to mistaken conclusions. Typically, evasion is exemplified by politicians dodging questions and really never answering what is being asked. However, sometimes when the question really gets to them, they become aggressive and try to evade by attacking the question or the questioner. Here's a good example of escalating invective in a desperate attempt to avoid answering questions. Do you have a principle that you can use to determine when we should invade another country and when we should not?
The problem is that you're trying to reduce this to single litmus paper tests, and that's not the way any reasonable person makes decisions about national security or foreign policy issues.
Okay, well, let me ask you
this. Your approach is extremely simple-minded, if I may say so.
I was just trying to see if there was a general principle, but apparently you don't have one that you say is a litmus test that you can use to differentiate when you should invade another country and when you should not.
You know, you really are one of the worst interviewers I've ever dealt with.
And how am I? How's that? Because I'm asking for a general principle, and that is simplistic.
Because you have an extraordinarily simplistic, single-minded view of the way that foreign policy ought to be conducted.
I just asked you if you had a principle. You could say, no, I don't have one.
I'm not going to say that I have no principle.
We didn't go to Kuwait to defend an ally, did we?
You know, I've probably had 150 interviews in the last year, and you're the worst interviewer that I've been with.
In what sense? Why have my questions been unfair to you?
No, they're not unfair. They're just sort of stupid.
Here's some more invective in an attempt to evade.
Sometimes it is too subtle, and sometimes these arguments don't lend themselves to banal questions.
And you can't answer yes or no whether he used weapons of mass destruction against us in the last 24 years. You can't answer that yes or no. Is that correct?
I must say, that is one of the most insulting questions I've had so far.
But as far as we can tell, with the evidence we have that's been made public, he has not used weapons of mass destruction against us in the last 24 years, right?
I'm sorry. I'm not going to answer the question.
You don't want to answer that question?
I'm going to answer the question only in the way that I
Okay, if you don't
think
want
is
to answer
accurate.
it, it's okay.
No, I'm not going to answer the same stupid question formulated in the same stupid way.
If it's so stupid, why couldn't you answer?
Because it's so stupid.
Why couldn't you
It's so stupid.
sometimes they will try to avoid answering the question by complimenting the questioner. Can we account for immigrants of all countries that have been in here, from India, and we can't account for immigrants from Mexico and from everywhere? Is that a reason why you're going to attack a country, because you can't account for their immigrants?
No.
And you assume,
you know what's interesting, Jed? This is a very interesting rhetorical technique.
Do you assume that they are terrorists because you can't account for them?
I've got to give you credit, Jan. Very interesting rhetorical technique.
Another way they try to evade facts and the flaws in their reasoning is by running away or breaking up the interview. Have my questions been unfair to you?
No, they're not unfair. They're just sort of stupid.
Why are they stupid?
Because you're asking for
a principle. I want to understand a principle that would permit people to know when we should. A principle, we've defined what a principle is. A general rule that you can use to know when you should do something and when you shouldn't do something. That gives you intellectual guidance.
You believe that principle is litmus paper test. I have explained to you the several principles that are important, and I'm afraid now I'm going to have to go to my other appointment. It was very nice to be with you.
You can't answer the other questions we have? Excuse me, sir. You're taking the microphone with you. Mr. Gaffney is so intent on evading the facts raised by my questions that he also decides to break up the interview. Well, let me ask you other questions, because I just wanted to get a straight answer on that question. And I told you we could move on.
A straight answer.
Well, let me ask you this. I want to know your view on Saddam. Do you think Saddam...
I have given you my view on Saddam.
Well, let me ask you some questions about it.
I think I'm on mic, and so we're out of time, and so we're off camera as far as I'm concerned. If you would please turn off the camera.
Let me ask you the questions and then you answer them.
No.
Didn't you say we should do that originally?
Is that camera off?
You think it's...
Is that camera off?
Do you think that Saddam...
I'm going to break this if somebody doesn't get this off me right now.
Oh, okay, well...
Listen.
Let's take it out. Watch Congressman Hayworth's press secretary jump in front of the camera to prevent any further questions. Well, let me ask you this. I just have a couple of minutes. Excuse me.
That is the last word.
I can't ask you...
Thanks, Jan. I'm glad to have you in. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Did you find it intellectually stimulating?
I found it very interesting, and I thank you for the chance to come by and visit.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming. Fellas, thank you very much for coming by.
Even if you want to know the truth, if you use sloppy logic, you will also arrive at mistaken conclusions. For instance, if you jump to conclusions by excluding obvious possibilities from your analysis. When Congresswoman Wilson asked me, why else would Saddam have weapons of mass destruction if not to use them against us, she was guilty of this logical flaw. I simply pointed out all the other possible reasons why he could have weapons of mass destruction. Watch. Isn't it reasonable to assume that as long as we have the threat of an invasion or obliteration, he'll be held in check? He won't use the weapons of mass destruction.
Why would he be getting them then?
Well, for the same reason that other tyrants get them, to maybe intimidate a neighbor, or to have more power, or to attack. He used them on his own people, as you recall, you mentioned before. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different possibilities why he's getting the weapons. The president made the same mistake in his State of the Union address.
Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction. But why? The only possible explanation, the only possible use he could have for those weapons is to dominate, intimidate, or attack.
Obviously, there are other reasons why a nation would want to have weapons of mass destruction. Another example of sloppy logic is requiring someone to prove a negative. Often, it is not possible to prove that you don't have something. For instance, you cannot prove that you don't have your neighbor's television set. That is why in our system, if he thinks you have his television set, he has to prove it. However, in the case of Iraq, we require them to prove that they didn't have weapons of mass destruction instead of us proving that they did. Listen to the president.
He hadn't accounted for that material. He's given no evidence that he has destroyed it.
When a person has a conflict of interest, their judgment is often clouded. For instance, if your company stands to make a lot of money if we go to war, you may be more inclined to be pro-war. That is why when you go on TV to promote the war, they should disclose their conflict of interest, something that James Woolsey and others did not do. There were two social factors that led us to more rapidly be in favor of going to war. The first was our willingness to accept inconclusive, uncorroborated, and secret evidence as a basis for going to war. On the basis of fragmentary, uncorroborated, and inconclusive evidence, some people claimed that the Iraqis attacked us first and that we were simply acting in self-defense. We asked Arnold de Borgraaf what he thought of these allegations. There were a lot of people on television claiming that Saddam was responsible for not only 9/11, but also for Oklahoma City and the first World Trade bombing. In fact, Mr. Frank Gaffney specifically claimed these three things. What do you think of that claim?
I think it's twaddle in all its unrationed splendor.
Even Gaffney himself accepts that his so-called evidence is inconclusive. You should go by the evidence, shouldn't you?
The evidence is there, but it is not conclusive.
Clearly, the evidence required to make such a momentous decision as going to war should be conclusive, corroborated, and public. If Americans are willing to go to war on the basis of inconclusive, uncorroborated, or secret evidence, we can be led into any war our leaders want. The second social condition that led us to be in favor of the war is superpower-itis. After more than 10 years of hearing that we are the world's #1 superpower, many Americans have erroneously concluded that we can do anything we want with impunity. Consequently, we are more apt to act carelessly on the premise that there will be no consequences for rash decisions. However, being the world's #1 superpower does not make us invulnerable. For instance, Russia, China, and France all have the capacity to demolish us with a nuclear first strike. Therefore, we should rid ourselves of this reckless superpower mentality and instead have a cautious, restrained approach to foreign interventions, just like other nations should. In order to reason well on any subject, you need to identify principles that integrate the relevant facts and thus permit you to evaluate effectively. Our decision makers either don't have principles or their principles are contradictory. That's why they cannot reason effectively. Consequently, our foreign policy is contradictory and it exposes us to all the negative consequences that we discussed before. Why don't they have principles to guide their decision making? Well, one reason is because some of them don't even know what a principle is. Do you remember what Woolsey offered as a principle?
The principle is that over the last 80-some years, I think really beginning with the Wilson administration, the United States has successfully moved a large number of countries, only a handful by force of arms, toward democracy.
This is not a principle. This is simply a description of what he thinks is the history of our foreign policy. His so-called principle doesn't even address the question of when we should invade a country and when we should not. It simply tells us that sometimes in the past we have invaded and sometimes in the past we haven't. If you're not looking for a principle because you're against principles in principle, you certainly won't find one. Should we invade another country if Their leader is an evil dictator with weapons of mass destruction who has violated the rights of his citizens and attacks its neighbors.
It's impossible to make a general distinction, I think, based on general characteristics.
If Woolsey is correct, and one should not make general distinctions based on general characteristics, then it is impossible to have a principle, because that's what a principle is, a general distinction based on general characteristics. Having contradictory principles is just as bad as having no principles. Here is James Woolsey contradicting himself on whether we should use abstractions, i.e. principles, to make our foreign policy decisions.
One doesn't make foreign policy decisions based on abstraction.
However, 1 minute later, he denies being against using abstractions, that is, principles, to make foreign policy decisions. I'm trying to see if there's a principle. You say that these are abstractions, that we don't need a principle in order to evaluate effectively?
I haven't said we don't need a principle.
First he says you shouldn't use abstractions, then he says you should. Moreover, how can you even have a principle if?
It's impossible to make a general distinction, I think, based on general characteristics.
Here's another contradiction in James Woolsey's mind. He believes that if certain conditions are in place, we should always go to war. And at the same time, he believes that even though those conditions are all in place, maybe we shouldn't go to war. What are the conditions that are necessary and sufficient?
I'll tick them off for you, all right? There are at least half a dozen that are important. One is one needs to assess. So it seems to me there are at least 4 or 5.
Any country that followed, that had those 4 or 5 conditions, you would be in favor of invading?
It depends on the circumstance.
So then it's not a principle, because even if a situation complies with that situation, even if a situation complies with those conditions, you still think maybe we shouldn't invade. Watch Mr. Gaffney contradict himself on whether it would have been right for India to attack Pakistan preemptively. First, Mr. Gaffney claims it would have been justified and legitimate for India to attack Pakistan preemptively, and then he says it would have been wrong. When India was massing troops on the Pakistan border, would Pakistan have been justified in preempting India?
If anything, you could argue that the Indians would have been justified in attacking the Pakistanis.
I was just about to ask you that.
If people in India's situation are in the same situation the United States was in, having been murderously attacked by terrorists, go after the state that sponsored that terror, that is a legitimate exercise of the right of self-defense. When you ask the question, is it right?
Yeah, do you think it's right? I'm trying to find out what you think.
I'm answering the question from my point of view, as an American.
Right, do you think it would have been
My
right?
preference, my sense of what is right, is that they not do that. Simply because in that particular instance, you would almost certainly have seen the exchange of nuclear weapons against these two countries with the loss of possibly millions of lives. From my point of view, it was right to try to discourage them from doing that.
So it would have been wrong for them to do it, to attack preemptively?
It would have been legitimate from them to do it, but from our point of view, and I would argue from the point of view of Indian citizens as well, it would have been ill-advised, undesirable, and in that sense, wrong.
Clearly, we need to identify a proper principle to govern our foreign relations, and then stick to it. We can't get away with a contradictory foreign policy, full of double standards and no principles to guide us. This is not the America that I love. The America that I love is based on the right principles and the integrity to follow them. By now, I hope you're thinking, okay, what is the principle we should use to determine whether to invade another country? Let me offer one for your consideration, along with the reasoning that supports it. Self-defense and only self-defense is a proper rationale for military action by the government. The principle is, if we are attacked or are in imminent threat of attack, we should use military force. However, the government should never use military force if more Americans will die if we attack than if we don't. The principle we should use to determine whether to invade another country depends on our view of the proper function of government. What you think is the proper function of government should be based on your conclusions about what kind of government optimizes your opportunity for a happy life. So, let's start with the social requirements of your happiness. If you want to have the best chance of a happy, satisfied life, you need optimum protection of your life, the freedom to follow your own judgment, and keep the money that you make. In order to have the optimum protection of your life, liberty, and property, you need a social institution dedicated to fulfilling that function. You need a government. However, to the extent that the government attempts to perform additional functions, it will invariably force peaceful Americans to act against their judgment. For instance, when the government assumed the function of liberating Iraq, the people that were against the war were forced to support it financially. If the government goes on to assume the function of liberating North Korea, the people that are against liberating North Korea will be forced to support the liberation. The more additional functions that the government assumes, the more Americans will be forced to act against their judgment. To the extent that the government gets into the habit of forcing peaceful Americans to act against their judgment, we will all suffer. All of us will be less free and have less of a possibility of a happy life, because sooner or later, we too will be forced to support a cause that we detest. Therefore, if we want to optimize our pursuit of happiness, we need a government, but one limited to defending our individual rights. These are the important truths identified by our founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The Declaration of Independence expresses the proper function of government. It says, to secure these rights, governments are instituted. It doesn't give any other reason to create a government because there is no other legitimate reason. It doesn't say we need a government to feed the hungry of the world or to free the enslaved people of the world. The government's job is to make sure that other people and foreign governments do not use force or fraud against you, so that you can pursue your own life and your own happiness free from their interference. Therefore, all governmental actions must be justified on the basis of protecting the individual rights of Americans. For instance, liberating Iraqis is not required to defend your rights, and therefore cannot be justified as a proper function of government. It is not the government's call to decide when the individual citizens of the United States want to part with their blood and treasure to liberate foreign countries. Each citizen has the right to decide when to be a good Samaritan and when not to. If the government acts beyond its mandate and squanders our limited resources on liberation and protection schemes all over the world, our country will go bankrupt. We will also suffer all the other negative consequences that we have previously enumerated because we have deviated from the proper principle. In conclusion, if we want to optimize our pursuit of happiness, we need a limited government. A government limited to only attacking countries that have attacked us or are threatening to attack us. I hope you will give the facts and the reasoning I have presented in support of this principle serious consideration and make the right decision the next time we are faced with the choice to invade or not invade. Thanks for watching.